All right, Conjure Wife. Fritz Leiber wrote this, and it was published in 1943, entered public domain last year. And we've been reading it as a reward for all those people that wasted 200,000 channel points on this thing. Quite enjoy the story. It is a horror story that is kind of billed as the father, that's the wrong term, origin, something like that, of modern horror. I think it's actually kind of not horror in my own view, but maybe I have a different view of this than other people. But in any case, you know, if horror stories do make you squeamish or anything like that, please do take care. That's as much of a content warning as I can give. It also uses language that might have been more acceptable from a 1940s perspective and is less accessible these days. But I'm going to read it as is because that's the way the story is. All right, and without further ado, here's chapter 13 of Conjure Wife. Norman looked briefly across the campus before he went into Morton. The thing that startled him most was something he had not expected, the air of normality. True, he had not looked forward, at least consciously, to any outwardly demoniac manifestations, any physical stench of evil, but this feeling of wholesomeness, the little swarms of students trooping back to the dormitories or over to the campus soda fountain, the file of girls in white bound for a tennis lesson, the friendly smiles and nods, the way his own steps fell so easily and gratefully into the old familiar paths. Almost for a moment he wondered if everything else were not some crazy dream. It came to him with almost with a shock that things were outwardly as normally as they had ever been, that only with respect to himself had they changed. Don't fool yourself, the voice inside told him. Some of those laughing girls are already infected. Their very respectable mamas have given them delicate hints. Don't be too sure you know what they're thinking while they sip their cokes or chatter about their boyfriends. But there was much to be done this afternoon, and he had no right to waste a second. He turned into Morton and quickly mounted the stairs. His capacity for surprise was not yet exhausted, however, as he realized when he saw a group of students emerging from the classroom at the other end of the third-floor corridor, after having waited the usual 10 minutes for him to appear. That was right. He had classes and committee meetings and appointments. He slipped around the bend in the corridor before he was noticed. Taking suitable precautions, he entered his office. Nothing seemed to have been disturbed, but he was careful in his movements and on the alert for unfamiliar objects. He did not put his hand into any drawer without closely inspecting it first. One letter in the pile of accumulated mail was important. It was from Pollard's office, requesting him to appear before a meeting of the trustees later this week. He smiled with grim satisfaction. His career was still skidding downhill. Hempnell still had its fangs. He methodically removed certain sections from his files, stuffed his briefcase full, and made a package of the remainder. Then he took from his pocket a small, hard object and looked at it reflectively. It was made of lucite, and its shape was that of an egg. Sealed inside the thick, transparent shell were tiny bits of metal and fiber. It was the chief trophy of his stay in New York. His friend in industrial chemistry had been very mystified, but here it was. Placed in the Sawtell home, it ought to constitute the terminal of a kind of circuit and clear the way for the operations he intended to begin tonight, for the recovery of that which Evelyn Sawtell had taken and was holding captive. It remained to place it. After a last glance around, during which he noted that the estuary dragon had not been restored to whatever was its original position on the roof, he started downstairs. Outside, he met Mrs. Gunnison. This was something he had not anticipated with sufficient vividness. He was acutely conscious of the way his arms were encumbered by the bulky notes. For a moment he did not seem able to see her clearly. "Lucky I found you," she began immediately. "Harold's been trying every which way to get in touch with you. Where have you been?" Suddenly she registered on him as her old, blunt, sloppy self. With a sense of mingled relief and frustration, he realized that the warfare in which he was engaged was a strictly undercover affair, and that outwardly all relationships were the same as ever. He found himself explaining how Tansy and he and weekending with friends out in the country had gotten a touch of food poisoning, and how his message to Hempnell must have gone astray. This explanation was intended merely for general consumption. Routine excuses were still necessary, and this one had the added advantage of providing a reason for Tansy's appearance, if anyone should see her, and it would enable him to plead a recurrence of the attack as an excuse for neglecting his academic duties. He did not expect Mrs. Gunnison to believe it, but he ought to tell it to her just to be consistent. She accepted the story without comment, offered her sympathies, and went on to say, "But be sure and get in touch with Harold. I believe it has to do with that meeting of the trustees you've been asked to attend. You know, Harold thinks a great deal of you. Goodbye." Odd, but at the last moment he fancied he caught a note of genuine friendliness, a strange little look, as if she was appealing to him to do something. Could he possibly be wrong in his estimation of her? But there was work to do. Off campus, he hurried down a quiet side street to where his car was parked. With hardly a sideways glance at the motionless figure in the front seat, he stepped in and drove to Sawtell's. The house was bigger than they needed, and the front lawn was very formal, but the grass was yellow in patches, and the soldier-like rows of flowers looked neglected. "Wait here," he said. "Don't get out of the car under any circumstances." To his surprise, Hervey met him at the door. There were circles under Hervey's always worried eyes, and his fidgetiness was more than usually apparent. "I'm so glad you come," he said, pulling Norman inside. "I don't know what I'm going to do with all these departmental responsibilities on my shoulders. Classes having to be dismissed, stopgap instructors to be obtained, and the deadline on next year's catalog tomorrow? Here, come into my study." And he pushed Norman through a huge living room, expensively but stiffly furnished, into a dingy book-lined cubbyhole with one small window. "I'm almost out of my mind," he said. "I haven't dared stir out of the house since Evelyn was attacked Sunday night." "What? Haven't you heard?" He stopped and looked at Norman in surprise. Even here he had been trying to pace up and down, although there was not room enough. "Why, it was in the papers. Though I wondered why you didn't come over or call up. I kept trying to get you at your home in the office, but no one could locate you. Evelyn's been in bed since Sunday, and she gets hysterical if I even speak of going out of the house. Just now she's asleep, thank heavens." It was borne in on Norman that Sawtell was not even aware that he had been out of town. Hastily he related his trumped-up excuse. He wanted to get back to what had happened Sunday night. There was an idea forming at the back of his mind, but it was still nebulous. For the moment he neglected the real purpose of his visit. "Just my luck," Sawtell exclaimed tragically when Norman had finished. "The whole department falling apart the very first week I'm in charge of it. And young Stackpoole laid up with the flu." "Well managed," said Norman. "Sit down and tell me about Evelyn." Unwillingly, Sawtell cleared a space so he could perch on the cluttered desk. He groaned audibly when his eyes chanced to light on papers concerned with urgent business. "It happened about 4 o'clock Sunday morning," he began, still aimlessly fiddling with the papers. "I was awakened by a terrible scream. Evelyn's bed was empty. It was pitch dark out in the hall, but I could hear some sort of struggle going on downstairs, a bumping and threshing around." Suddenly he jerked up his head. "What was that? I thought I heard footsteps out in the front hall." Before Norman could say anything, he went on. "Oh, it's just my nerves. They've been acting up ever since. Well, I picked up something, a vase, and went downstairs. About that time, the sound stopped. I switched on the lights and went through all the rooms. In the sewing room, I found Evelyn stretched unconscious on the floor with some ghastly bruises beginning to show around her neck and mouth. Beside her lay the phone. We have it there because Evelyn has so many occasions to use it. I nearly went frantic. I called the doctor and the police." Norman knew now what must have happened. When Evelyn regained consciousness, she was able to tell us about it, although she was terribly shaken up. It seems the phone had rung. She went downstairs in the dark without waking me. Just as she was picking up the phone, a man jumped out of the corner and attacked her. She fought him off. Oh, it drives me mad to think of it. But he overpowered her and choked her unconscious. Norman listened with grim satisfaction. Thank heavens I came down when I did. That must have been what frightened him off. The doctor found that, except for the bruises, there weren't any other injuries. Even the doctor was shocked at those bruises, though. He said he had never seen any quite like them. The police think that after the man got in the house, he called Central and asked them to ring this phone, pretending he thought the bell was out of order or something, in order to lure someone downstairs. They were puzzled as to how he got inside, though, for all the windows and doors were shut fast. Probably I forgot to lock the front door when we went to bed. One of my pieces of unforgivable carelessness. The police think that he was a vicious burglar, but I believe he must have been a madman besides, because there was a silver plate on the floor, and two of our silver forks jammed together strangely, and other odds and ends. And he must have been playing the phonograph in the sewing room because it was open and the turntable was going, and on the floor was one of Evelyn's speech records, smashed to bits. Yes, the picture was all very clear now. What Norman had forgotten to take into consideration was the ever-present possibility of reaction, if magic miscarried, like the kick of a gun, or, better, like the breech of a gun blowing up. When he had severed the wire at Bayport, the thwarted agency of death had instantly struck back at the sender, and afterward Evelyn Sawtelle had invented the obvious story. One thing bothered him. If the police should trace the phone call in an effort to prove their own story, they would find it had been placed by Norman Saylor at Bayport. But at the worst, that would only convict him of a peculiar lie. For the present, he would say nothing about it. "It's all my fault," Sawtelle was repeating mournfully. Norman remembered that Sawtelle always assumed that he was guilty whenever anything hurt or merely upset Evelyn. "I should have awakened. I should have been the one to go down to the phone. When I think of that delicate creature feeling her way through the dark and lurking just ahead of her, oh, and the department. I'll tell you, I'm going out of my mind. Poor Evelyn has been in such a pitifully frightened state ever since, you wouldn't believe it." Good, thought Norman. If she's really frightened, she may be easier to deal with. The idea of pity never occurred to him. Moreover, if what he had been told about the lodgment of captive souls were true, then Tansy's soul had suffered equally with that of Evelyn Sawtelle here in this very house on Sunday night. "I tell you, I haven't slept a wink," Sawtelle was saying. "If Mrs. Gunnison hadn't been kind enough to spend a couple of hours with her yesterday morning, I don't know how I'd have managed. Even then, she was too frightened to let me stir. My God, Evelyn!" But it was really impossible to identify the agonized scream, except that it had come from the upper part of the house. Crying out, "I knew I heard footsteps! He's come back!" Sawtelle ran full tilt out of the study. Norman was just behind him, suddenly conscious of a very different fear. It was confirmed by a glance through the living room window at his empty car. He beat Sawtelle up the stairs and was the first to reach the bedroom door. He stopped. Sawtelle, almost gibbering with anxiety and guilt, ran into him. It was not at all what Norman expected. The pink silk coverlet clutched around her. Evelyn Sawtelle had retreated to the side of the bed nearest the wall. Her teeth were shattering, and her face was a dirty white. Beside the bed stood Tansy. For a moment Norman felt a great sudden hope. Then he saw her eyes, and the hope shot away with sickening swiftness. She was not wearing the veil. In that heavy makeup, with those rouged cheeks and thickly carmined lips, she looked like some indecently daubed statue, impossibly grotesque against that background of ridiculously feminine pink silk hangings, but a hungry statue. Sawtelle scrambled past him, shouting, "What's happened? What's happened?" He saw Tansy. "I didn't know you were here. When did you come in?" "Then you frightened her." The statue spoke, and its quiet accents hushed him. "Oh, no, I didn't frighten her, did I, Evelyn?" Evelyn Sawtelle was staring at Tansy in abject, wide-eyed terror, and her jaw was still shaking. But when she spoke, it was to say, "No, Tansy didn't frighten me. We were talking together, and then I thought I heard a noise." "Just a noise, dear," Sawtelle said, somewhat taken aback. "Yes, like footsteps, very quiet footsteps in the hall." She did not take her eyes off Tansy, who nodded once when she had finished. Norman accompanied Sawtelle on a futile search of the top floor. When they came back, Evelyn was alone. "Tansy's gone out to the car," she told Norman weakly. "I'm sure I just imagined those footsteps." But her eyes were still full of fear when he left her, with Sawtelle fussing about, straightening the coverlet and shaking out the pillows. As he went down the stairs, he became aware of a hard object in his pocket, and he remembered the lucite egg. He had not placed it. But as things stood now, he must first know more. Tansy was sitting in the car, staring ahead. He could see that the body was still dominated by its one emotion. He did have to ask a question. "She does not have my soul," were the words. I questioned her at length. As a final and certain test, I embraced her. That was when she screamed. She is very much afraid of the dead. What did she tell you? She said that someone came and took my soul from her. Someone who did not trust her very much. Someone who desired my soul to keep as a hostage for other reasons. Mrs. Gunnison. He had seen it and not known. The knuckles of his hands were white on the steering wheel. That puzzling look of appeal that Mrs. Gunnison had given him. For an instant, Tansy had managed to look out of her eyes, and he had not known it.